The image of the medieval knight is etched into our collective consciousness. A noble warrior in gleaming plate, a symbol of honor, courage, and an entire epic. We see him in the pages of novels, in historical films, and even in children's fairy tales. A figure encased in steel, astride a mighty warhorse, ready to fight for his lady or his lord. This image is so familiar, so romanticized, that it seems unshakable, as if carved from stone. We accept it without question as historical fact. But what if this beautiful picture is merely a facade? A convenient screen, concealing a series of inexplicable and disturbing anomalies? What if everything we think we know about the knight is not the whole truth, but only the part that is convenient to tell, without asking uncomfortable questions? One need only turn away from the heroic epics and look at the dry, cold facts for this familiar world to begin cracking at the seams. An impression forms there to ignore the glaring inconsistencies that jut out from the accepted narrative, so as not to disturb the established canons. They seem willing to dismiss obvious technological elements as beautiful but useless, and logical fallacies as mere peculiarities of the era. When facts contradict a theory, it is far easier to declare the facts an anomaly than to reconsider the theory itself. But what if these anomalies are the very key to the puzzle? What if the suit of armor was not just a protective shell for a human, but something else entirely? Something that pushes official science into a dead end? Let us ask the central question. Was the man we so readily imagine even inside? From this single question, a path opens into a labyrinth of enigmas, where each new fact provides no answer, but only breeds deeper doubt. Delving into the chronicles and documents of the age, we encounter rules and customs that appear not just strange, but absolutely illogical from the standpoint of human psychology and military tactics. We are told of wars where the rules of engagement were so absurd they force us to question the sanity of their participants. Imagine an army that was to be completely, physically annihilated upon the loss of a single one of its warriors. A knight. This was not merely an incentive for his protection. It was a system where the value of one figure was immeasurably higher than thousands of other lives. This custom is well documented, yet no rational explanation for it exists. Why was the survival of an entire army made directly dependent on one combatant, as if he were not a commander, but something akin to a heart, whose stopping would cause the entire body to perish? This value system, where one figure is worth more than thousands, is found again in even stranger rules of combat. Picture the scene. A simple foot soldier, in the heat of battle, finds himself standing beside an enemy knight. In that moment, the known world dissolves, replaced by a protocol so alien, it calls into question not just the war he is fighting, but the very nature of the foe he truly faces. He might have turned the tide. A single, decisive blow. A hand offered to a beleaguered commander. But he could not. For a common soldier to lay a hand upon a knight was to invite an immediate and final retribution. The intent, whether born of malice or loyalty, was irrelevant. Only a knight could touch a knight. At first glance, it appears to be the pinnacle of aristocratic snobbery, a rule born of class and privilege. Historians have long explained it as a practical matter, the preservation of a noble captive for a lucrative ransom. But this logic crumbles under the brutal calculus of combat. In the chaos of a pitched battle, with the fate of kingdoms hanging in the balance, would victory truly be risked for the sake of such a fragile etiquette? A high-value target would be seized by any means, by any man available. Unless the knight was not merely a man in armor, unless the rule was something other than a code of honor. If we dare to re-examine the premise, the prohibition takes on a darker, yet more logical dimension. It ceases to be a question of chivalry and becomes a technical protocol. As if only the operator of an identical system knew the correct procedure for engagement, how to disable it, how to take it under control, without triggering some catastrophic failure or a devastating defensive reaction. The duel is thus transformed. It is no longer a contest between two warriors, but a confrontation between two systems, where the interference of an outside element is not only forbidden, but perhaps lethally dangerous to all. This image of profound absurdity is sharpened by accounts of battles that can scarcely be called battles at all. The chronicles speak of singular contests, where two knights would meet on the field, their duel lasting for days. All the while, their armies, thousands of men strong, simply stood and watched. They did not engage. They attempted no flanking maneuvers. They offered no aid to their leader. They were but spectators in a theater of war, where the only actors on stage were the two figures in their iron masks. And when one knight finally conceded defeat, what followed was not a rout, but a transaction. The vanquished army was not scattered or destroyed. Instead, with the consent of its defeated commander, it was transferred in its entirety to the command of the victor. This was not the aftermath of combat. It was a transfer of assets, as if the army itself was not a collection of living men, but a resource, a property, passed from one controller to another upon the fact of capitulation. In time, this strange role of the knight as the central controlling element would transform. The living man would be replaced by an inanimate object. The standard, the banner, a flag bearing a sigil and, according to some obscure sources, even a light upon its staff. The Le Unit, though with less fatal consequences for its men. But the very substitution of a thinking, breathing commander for a lifeless icon only deepens the mystery. It suggests that the knight's primary function was never truly human. It was symbolic. It was control. A focal point around which the machinery of war could pivot, and without which it would simply cease to function. The strange, illogical codes of war paint the knight not as a man, but as something other, a unique figure at the center of a system governed by inhuman rules. If their existence on the battlefield was so heavily regulated, so isolated from the common soldier, what then of their daily life? If they fought so strangely, how did they live? Especially during the long marches of a campaign, locked inside their steel for weeks on end. When the oddities of combat give way to the realities of life on the move, we encounter mysteries even more unsettling, for they touch the very foundations of biological survival. Historical accounts suggest a knight could remain encased in his armor for weeks at a time, whether on the march or during a siege. This detail, often presented as a feat of incredible endurance, unravels upon the slightest scrutiny into an unresolvable problem. Imagine for a moment a human being completely sealed within a metal shell. The first, most fundamental question is one of simple physiology. How did an individual in such confinement attend to their natural needs? The answer, offered by certain chronicles, is as simple as it is monstrous. Directly into the suit. This single detail shatters the romantic image. But the issue is not one of aesthetics. It is one of elementary biology. Beneath the steel plates, the knight wore a padded undergarment, a gambeson, or akaton. For any person forced to exist under these conditions, their armor would become a hermetic container of human waste. Constant contact with these substances would inevitably lead to severe skin diseases, to rashes and ulcerations, and ultimately to sepsis. But the horror does not end there. Historians, sifting through archives, have unearthed evidence of an even more shocking practice. To cope with the consequences of such an existence, it is claimed that knights were periodically rinsed. Several times a day, water would be poured into the armor through a lifted visor or a joint in the neck plate. The design of certain helmets, when examined closely, seems purpose-built for this very act. They resemble a funnel with an eye slit that, from the inside, angles upward, a convenient channel for pouring in liquid. Now, let us assemble the pieces of this grim mosaic. A man is trapped in an enclosed metal space. He wears a thick, quilted undergarment, now perpetually sodden. This wet fabric is pressed tight against a body steeped in its own filth. In such conditions, even without the strain of combat, the human organism would face catastrophic consequences. The constant dampness would lead to hypothermia, even in warm weather. The skin, deprived of air and immersed in an aggressive, caustic environment, would begin to rot while the man was still alive. The very symbol of chivalry becomes a walking tomb, a testament to an ideal so powerful it was willing to sacrifice the human being at its core. The legend of the knight was not written on parchment, but etched into the suffering flesh of the man inside the steel. A single scratch, a minor abrasion, and the steel shell instantly becomes a breeding ground for infection. How long could a person survive inside such a wet, decaying cocoon before succumbing to sepsis or pneumonia? Weeks? More likely days, if not hours. To this grim reality, we add another legend, one often taken as a metaphor for extraordinary endurance: the knight who slept standing. What impossible strength of will, what devotion to duty would be required to bear such torment, only to then be denied even the most basic rest? Human physiology demands relaxation, a horizontal state for the body to recover, for blood to circulate. To remain perpetually upright, encased in heavy armor, would lead to severe edema, vascular collapse, and the complete exhaustion of the nervous system. Endurance and will are formidable forces, but they cannot repeal the fundamental laws of biology. When these factors are combined, the pervasive filth, the constant dampness, the absence of proper sleep, they paint a portrait not of discomfort, but of a slow and agonizing demise. Survival seems a biological impossibility. Official history offers clumsy explanations, attributing it all to the severities of the age and the fantastic conditioning of medieval warriors. We are told of the laborers who hauled the great stones of the pyramids. Why not believe in knights who lived for weeks in sodden steel? But what if this is not a story of phenomenal human resilience? What if our entire premise is flawed from the very beginning? What if this entire system, this armor, was never intended for the fragile human body as we know it? Let us, for a moment, cease to see the knight as merely a man. Let us instead examine his armor with the eyes of an engineer. Perhaps the answers are not hidden in tales of human fortitude, but in the very metal itself, in its form, its function, its secrets. When we begin to study surviving suits of armor not as museum pieces, but as functional mechanisms, the questions only multiply. Instead of a perfect defense molded to the warrior's anatomy, we find a host of design choices that seem not merely inconvenient, but frankly incompatible with the human form. These engineering anomalies appear so frequently that they cannot be dismissed as the work of an unskilled CM, a template that did not quite align with human anthropometry. We begin with the most critical element for any combatant: vision. A helmet must protect the head, but it must also allow the wearer to see his enemy. Yet on many medieval helms, the eye slits are placed in a baffling configuration. If one were to place an average human head inside, the eyes would align either significantly above or far below these apertures. To see anything at all would require a posture so unnatural, so strained, that it defies all logic of combat or survival. It is an irreconcilable flaw, a riddle written not in ink but forged in iron, one that challenges the very image of the figure who stood within. To see, a warrior would be forced to hold his head in a perpetually unnatural position, tilted sharply upward or craned impossibly down. To engage in combat under these conditions, to track the fluid motion of an enemy while maintaining one's own balance, is a task that borders on the impossible. It is an attempt to command a vehicle at speed while perceiving the world through the narrow slit of a mail slot. A strange feeling emerges, that the wearer of such a helm was not navigating by sight, but by some other sense, as if information were being fed to them through an unknown channel. The enigma deepens when we consider the limbs. The foundation of any martial art is freedom of movement, yet the construction of certain plate pauldrons, the armor of the shoulder, utterly contradicts this principle. In these examples, the shoulder plates are fused directly to the cuirass, with no degree of articulation. This unyielding bond makes a full lunge or a powerful swing a mechanical impossibility. The arm simply cannot extend forward to deliver a thrusting blow. The movements of a warrior encased in such steel would be hobbled, constrained, a state tantamount to suicide in the chaos of real battle. Any combat system built around such armor would have to be entirely alien to the fencing arts we know. But the most astonishing puzzle is forged into the protection for the legs. Many early examples of greaves, the armor covering the shin, are a single solid tube of metal, contoured to the calf muscle and flowing seamlessly into a covering for the foot. The heel, as we know it, is absent. The boot portion curves directly into the sole, and critically, these greaves possess no doors, no hinges, no seams. They are monolithic. One must then confront a simple physical problem. How does a human being pass their foot with its L-shaped ankle through a narrow, solid pipe? It is a geometric impossibility. To don such an element of armor, one would either need to detach their own foot or possess limbs of an inhuman flexibility, capable of bending at unthinkable angles. The only other alternative, that the armor was several sizes too large, would negate its entire protective function. Curiously, later designs would incorporate small, hinged doors at the calf, fastened with crude laces or clasps. This would seem to be the solution. Yet the very fact that it was absent in the original designs and that the later editions were so flimsy suggests this was not an evolution, but an adaptation, a clumsy attempt to retrofit an alien technology for the needs of an ordinary human. The paradox returns. Fitton had no visor that could be opened. To wear one, the head had to be inserted from below, through the opening for the neck. But here again, the opening was often too narrow, the unyielding metal a cage that logic dictates could never have been entered. We are left staring at artifacts that defy their own purpose. They stand as silent steel monuments to a baffling contradiction, and in their impossible design, they force us to question not only the function of the armor, but the very nature of the warrior who was meant to wear it. It is not woven fabric. It offers no give, no concession to the flesh within. To force a human head at its widest point across the ears through the narrow steel collar of a gorget is to attempt the impossible. It is an act akin to driving a fist through the neck of a glass bottle. It simply will not work. This strange architecture repeats itself. The peculiar placement of the eye slits, the rigid confinement of the shoulders, the single, seamless plates encasing the legs. These are not random errors in craftsmanship. They form a consistent pattern, a litany of design choices that raises a chilling question. Was this armor ever intended for a human being? It seems engineered for another anatomy entirely. A creature with a different arrangement of the eyes, a foreign biomechanics in its joints, perhaps with thinner, more flexible limbs, or even a skull of a completely different shape. The engineering flaws are too systematic to be accidental. They compel us to view this steel shell from a profoundly different angle. But it is in the helm where the true enigma resides. This is not merely faceless protection. Many are fashioned into grotesque, terrifying masks. They are visages of fear, of something other than human. In studying the helmets of medieval knights, we enter a territory where rational explanation begins to fail. If the primary function of armor is defense, then many of these creations defy that logic entirely. Instead of smooth, glancing surfaces, perfectly shaped to deflect a blow, we often find true works of art, frightening, bizarre, and, from a warrior's perspective, fatally flawed. These are not just helmets. They are metal faces, frozen in horrific grimaces, with hypertrophied features, bestial snarls, and empty, inhuman eye sockets. Official history explains this as an effort to terrify the enemy. But in the brutal calculus of combat, where life is measured in moments, a warrior would surely choose reliable and convenient protection over a decorative element, however frightening. Moreover, the complex shapes, the numerous protrusions and reliefs of such a helm would become a perfect trap for an enemy's blade, increasing the chance of a fatal piercing, not diminishing it. Consider the horizontal slit of a mouth on certain examples. What purpose could it serve in battle? To spit insults? Or something else? These helmets seem less a means of protecting a human face, and more a means of replacing it. A seditious thought emerges. What if these metal masks were not an imitation of a face, but were the face itself? What if they were an integral part of the being inside, its true, unchangeable physiognomy? This hypothesis is bolstered by other strange design elements. On many helms, near the ears, one can observe bizarre, decorative ear guards. But why create such a complex and vulnerable detail simply for adornment? From an engineering standpoint, such a corrugated surface invites, rather than repels, a weapon's point. The steel does not lie. It was built recurve and rivet. It asks the same silent, unsettling question. If this armor was not made for us, then for whom was the battle fought? The very structure seems engineered to capture and amplify sound vibrations. It bears a striking resemblance to the membrane of a speaker or a primitive auditory device. This suggests it was not decoration, but a vital sensory organ, allowing the entity inside the armor to navigate its world. To perceive frequencies a human ear, muffled by steel and cloth, could never detect. And such elements were not confined to the helmets alone. Compounding the acoustic strangeness, certain helms incorporated a perplexing form of hydraulics. Their construction often resembled a funnel, as if specifically adapted for a liquid to be poured in from above. In a wider context, such a design could have served to deliver a nutrient solution, or perhaps a cooling fluid, essential for sustaining the life functions of an organism sealed within this metallic cocoon. This transforms the helmet from simple protective headwear into a complex interface, connecting its wearer to the external world through visual slits, acoustic membranes, and a refueling port. In this light, the helmet ceases to be a mere mask. It becomes the central component of a system, its head in both the literal and figurative sense. Its terrifying visage is not an attempt to intimidate a human enemy, but perhaps the true likeness of its owner, a reflection of its non-human nature. These grotesque faces, frozen in metal, gaze at us across the centuries, and their silence is more terrifying than any scream. They are the missing piece of a puzzle that is beginning to form a single, disturbing picture. We see a code of illogical military conduct, seemingly devised for beings other than men. We face living conditions inside the armor that are utterly lethal to a human. We discover a design that contradicts the very principles of human anatomy. And finally, we look into the face of this enigma, the frightening, inhuman masks of the helms. Each of these threads, taken alone, seems a mere historical curiosity. But woven together, they form a tapestry in which there is no place for the familiar image of the knight. When all the pieces are assembled, what image begins to emerge? The legends and ancient engravings, once dismissed as the fantasies of artists, now offer one final, chilling clue. The bizarre rules of engagement, the unlivable internal environment, the inhuman construction of the armor and its chilling facade, all of it points in a single, unnerving direction. But the last and most crucial element, the one that binds the entire structure together, is found not in an artifact of steel, but in the whispers of ancient legends and the ink of forgotten illustrations. It is a story official history dismisses as mere folklore, a flight of artistic hyperbole. What if it was not metaphor, but testimony? In countless cultures, we find the legend of the warrior who fights on, long after his head has been struck from his shoulders. We have been taught to see this as a symbol, an emblem of impossible courage, of a will to victory that transcends death itself. But what if the description was meant to be taken literally? The legends are unambiguous. A decapitated knight could, for a time, remain in the fight. This chilling image finds its echo in ancient engravings. We witness scenes where a single brutal strike severs a knight's head, helmet and all. But this does not lead to an immediate collapse. More disturbing are the actions of the victor. Instead of confirming his triumph, he begins a series of manipulations that can hardly be called a finishing blow. In one depiction, we see the victor foregoing any strike to the body. Instead, he attempts to thread his sword into the open neck hole of the vanquished armor. His actions resemble not the slaying of a man, but the deliberate decommissioning of a machine. It is intended to disable something vital held deep inside. Historians explain this away as symbolism, or perhaps a frantic attempt to salvage expensive armor in the heat of battle. But such actions, in the crucible of combat, are absurd. A more logical, if unsettling, conclusion presents itself. Removing the head and helmet was not immediately fatal. It merely disabled the primary control, the main sensory module. The system within the armor, however, continued to function. To shut it down completely, one had to damage the internal mechanisms through the only available opening. These disparate facts, from the illogical customs of war to a literal reading of myth, all converge upon a single, shocking hypothesis, one that explains everything. The knight's plate armor was not armor in our modern sense. It was something more. It was an exoskeleton, a complex biomechanical system, perhaps autonomous or semi-autonomous. It served either as an external shell and life support for some other non-human biological entity, or it was itself the body. Within this framework, every historical anomaly falls into place. The inhuman living conditions were perfectly normal for a creature whose physiology was unlike our own. The ritualistic washing with water could have been part of a cooling system or a method of sustenance. The inability to relieve oneself in a human manner was not a problem if the organism's metabolism was alien, or if the system possessed integrated waste disposal functions. And the notoriously cumbersome design of the armor. It was not made for a human. It was a perfect anatomical fit for its true occupant. The silent figures of iron that stare at us from across the centuries may not be guarding the secrets of men. They may be guarding a secret about what it once meant to be human at all. The seamless steel of a knight's armor. It speaks of an age of honor, of human strength encased in metal. But its very perfection presents a paradox. Solid, articulated pauldrons and greaves should have been impossibly restrictive, yet they were not. This hints at a fundamental misunderstanding, that the biomechanics within the suit were utterly alien to our own. Consider the strange, intimidating helms. We see them as masks, designed to frighten. But what if they were not masks at all? What if they were the true, sensor-laden heads of the beings inside? Suddenly, the bizarre codes of war are cast in a new, chilling light. The rule that only a knight could capture another knight ceases to be a matter of honor. It becomes a technical necessity. Only the operator of one such system knew the protocols to safely disable and interact with another. The catastrophic collapse of an entire army upon the fall of its knight was not a failure of morale, but the shutdown of a central control unit. The human soldiers under its command, mere subordinate assets, were rendered instantly useless. Even the ancient legends of headless warriors ceased to be metaphor. If the helmeted head was but one module of a larger system, an important one, but a module nonetheless, its loss would not mean the immediate termination of all function. This leads to a staggering conclusion, that beneath the polished steel of the medieval knight was not a man, but a member of a non-human, or perhaps post-human, civilization. A being that required a sophisticated exoskeleton simply to exist in our world. The people who surrounded them, the squires, the foot soldiers, were not comrades in arms. They were technical support staff, attendants. If this theory holds, it unearths questions of a global scale. Where did these beings go? What became of their incredible technology? And why was their place taken by humans, clumsily mimicking their armor, transforming its functional elements into hollow decoration? As the Renaissance dawns, the nature of armor changes. It does not evolve, it devolves. Hatches appear on leg plates, fastened by simple straps and laces. Neck gorgets widen. Helms are fitted with complex visors, specifically to allow a human head to pass through. The quality of the forging, despite the apparent increase in complexity, paradoxically falls. The single, precisely wrought plates of the earlier age are replaced by cruder, composite constructions. Is this not evidence of a civilization left behind? Of humans attempting to copy a technology they could not comprehend? They saw the outer form, the metal suit, and tried to replicate it, forcing it to conform to their own inadequate anatomy. Where there was once a single, seamless piece, there were now hinges and leather. Official history carefully sidesteps these anomalies, preferring convenient tales of noble warriors. It refuses to acknowledge that within the pages of our past, there may be a vast, frightening, and entirely unexamined chapter. A version of history that leaves us to confront a far more troubling reality: that the grand narrative of humanity may be built upon the ruins of something far older and far greater than ourselves. A design once perfectly suited for a non-human limb now had to be cut and refitted with crude lacing. Where a complex sensory helmet once sat, there appeared a simple metal pot with slits for eyes. Functional elements, their purpose lost to time, devolved into useless beauty, into decorative flourishes and heraldic crests. The age of iron phantoms gave way to an age of human imitation. Knighthood, once a phenomenon, became a social institution. The exoskeleton became mere armor. And so, the question of legacy arises. Today, the museums and armories of the world hold a colossal inventory of medieval weaponry. By some counts, we are speaking of tens of thousands of exhibits, approximately 3,840 cuirasses, helmets, and shields, more than 2,400 blades, over 5,000 polearms, and thousands of early firearms. We are told this is the equipment of soldiers from the 15th to the 18th centuries. But what if a significant portion of this arsenal, particularly the earliest and most sophisticated examples, is not simply weaponry? What if these are the remains, the artifacts, of an entire civilization we have overlooked? These are not just pieces of metal. They are the skeletons, the very shells of those who once walked this earth, who fought on its battlefields and commanded its armies. We gaze upon them in museums, admiring the skill of the smiths, but perhaps we are looking at the remains of the smiths themselves, at their true form. All of this forces us to return to the beginning, and to ask the most fundamental question: why does this version of history seem so unbelievable? Perhaps because established science prefers to ignore what does not fit into the accepted picture of the world. It is simpler to label an obvious structural component a ritual decoration than to admit we do not comprehend its purpose. It is easier to dismiss illogical historical facts as the strange customs of a brutal age than to concede that those customs may not have been human at all. This position is convenient. It requires no revision of thousands of dissertations and textbooks. It allows us to remain the sole intelligent masters of our planet and of our own history. But the facts are stubborn. They lie in museum display cases. They stare out from the pages of ancient manuscripts. They cry out that our past may be far more complex, strange, and frightening than we are accustomed to believe. We have been offered a beautiful, simple fairy tale about knights in shining armor. But perhaps the time has come to mature and to begin asking the uncomfortable questions. To see the armor not as a costume, but as a mechanism. To read the legends not as fiction, but as encrypted testimony. To seek answers not in ready-made explanations, but in the very anomalies so diligently ignored. For it is there, hidden within the inconsistencies and the illogical, that the key to understanding our own story may lie buried, waiting to be rediscovered. They emerge from the mists of legend, figures forged in iron and resolve, the knights of the Middle Ages. Yet, as we gaze upon the cold steel of their effigies and the faded ink of their chronicles, a deeper question arises. We are forced to ask not only who these men were, but what. What was the true nature of the force that dwelled within the armor? History, we discover, is not a closed book. It is a manuscript whose most astonishing chapters, perhaps, still lie waiting in the dark, their pages yet to be turned. The final truth of our own past has not yet been written.